Welcome to Threads of the Plains, a captivating Wild West tale of woven legacies and untamed hearts. Step onto the golden plains where the wind whispers secrets of a rugged frontier past. A skilled weaver's craft sparks an unexpected bond under a sky streaked with promise, weaving a journey of trust and peril amidst a bustling fairground. Join us as the dust settles and the story unfolds on this vast, unforgiving land. Chapter 1. Dust and Promises. The wind, a restless spirit, whipped across the golden plains, carrying the scent of dry grass, distant wood smoke, and the faint, sweet fragrance of the last wildflowers clinging to life before the first frost. Lila Redfeather knelt, her fingers tracing the intricate pattern woven into the blanket spread before her. It was a story, this blanket a tale of her people, the Shoshone, of resilience and loss, of survival against a landscape as beautiful as it was unforgiving. The colors, drawn from roots and berries, echoed the hues of the setting sun, deep crimson, fiery orange, and the soft, fading gold of the prairie grass. Lila was 21, but her eyes held a wisdom that belied her years. They were the color of dark, polished river stones, reflecting the vast, open sky above. Her hands, calloused yet graceful, were a testament to her skill, a legacy passed down from her mother, whose spirit now resided in the wind and the woven threads. Her mother's dying wish, whispered on a breath thin as cottonwood fluff, had been for Lila to preserve their stories, to keep the spirit of their ancestors alive through her craft. "This one," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the wind's sigh. "This one tells of the great migration, of the journey across the mountains, of the promise of a new land." A pang of loneliness, sharp and familiar, pierced her heart. The promise of a new land. Lila yearned for a promise of her own, a purpose that extended beyond duty, beyond the intricate patterns she wove. She loved her craft, felt the spirit of her ancestors flow through her fingers. But a part of her, a wild, untamed part, longed for something more. The trading fair was a kaleidoscope of sights and sounds. Wagons, their canvas covers bellowing like the sails of ships lost on a sea of grass, formed a haphazard circle. The air buzzed with the chatter of voices, the cries of hawkers, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the nervous whinny of horses. The smell of roasted meat mingled with the tang of sweat and leather, the sharp, acrid scent of cheap whiskey. Lila had spread her blankets on a patch of relatively clear ground near a wagon, piled high with the brightly colored fabrics and gleaming pots and pans. She'd traveled for 3 days from her small, isolated cabin, nestled in the foothills of the Wind River Mountains. It was a journey she made twice a year, a necessary pilgrimage to trade her weavings for supplies, for the staples that would see her through the harsh Wyoming winter. A shadow fell across her blankets. Lila looked up, shielding her eyes against the glare of the afternoon sun. A man stood there, tall and lean, his silhouette framed against the vast azure sky. He wore the weathered garb of a cowboy, worn leather chaps, a faded denim shirt, a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were the color of the sky just after a storm, a clear, piercing blue, tinged with a hint of gray, like distant thunderclouds. He stood silently for a moment, his gaze sweeping over her blankets, lingering on the one depicting the Great Migration. There was a quiet intensity about him, a sense of stillness that contrasted with the bustling energy of the fair. He carried himself with the easy grace of a man accustomed to the open range, to the solitude of the saddle. "These are fine work," he said, his voice low and gravelly, like stones tumbling in a creek bed. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. delivered with a quiet respect that surprised her. Most traders haggled, their eyes assessing the blankets with a cold, calculating glint. This man, however, seemed to see something more than just a commodity. Lila nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "They tell stories," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "Stories of my people." He knelt, his movements surprisingly fluid for a man of his build. He reached out a hand, his fingers, calloused and scarred, tracing the outline of a woven mountain range on the blanket. "This one," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This one speaks of loss." Lila felt a shiver run down her spine. He understood. He saw the sorrow woven into the threads, the grief that lingered like the scent of smoke after a fire. It was a rare thing, this understanding, especially from a man who looked as though he'd weathered more storms than most. "My mother taught me," Lila said, her voice catching slightly. She is gone now." The man's gaze met hers, his blue eyes filled with a depth of empathy that startled her. He didn't offer empty condolences, didn't utter the platitudes that so often fell from the lips of strangers. He simply held her gaze, acknowledging her pain, sharing it in the silence that stretched between them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single silver coin. It was worn smooth with age, the image of the eagle barely visible. It was likely his last, Lila realized with a pang of guilt. She knew the hardship of this life, the constant struggle for survival. "I'll trade you for this one," he said, his voice still low, his gaze fixed on the blanket. "It's all I have." Lila hesitated. The blanket was worth far more than a single silver coin. It represented weeks of work, countless hours of painstaking labor. But there was something in his eyes, a desperate need, a yearning that mirrored her own, that made her unable to refuse. "It's yours," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She reached out and took the coin, her fingers brushing against his, and a spark, unexpected and intense, passed between them. It was a fleeting touch, a momentary connection, but it left her breathless, her heart pounding against her ribs. He carefully folded the blanket, his movements deliberate and respectful. He held it close, as if it were something precious, something sacred. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My name is Eli Tanner." "Lila Redfeather," she replied, her voice still trembling slightly from the unexpected intensity of their encounter. As Eli straightened, preparing to leave, a harsh voice cut through the air. "Hold it right there, cowboy." A burly man, his face red with anger, strode towards them, his hand resting on the butt of the revolver strapped to his hip. He wore a fancy vest and a silk cravat, the ostentatious garb of a man who wanted to appear wealthier than he was. He was flanked by two younger men, their faces hard and wary. "That blanket belongs to me," the man snarled, his eyes fixed on Eli. "I saw him steal it." Lila gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. "That's not true," she exclaimed. "I traded him the blanket. He paid me for it." The man ignored her, his gaze unwavering on Eli. "You're a liar and a thief," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "I saw you sneaking around my wagon earlier. You were eyeing my goods." Eli stood his ground, his body tense, his hand instinctively moving towards the knife sheathed at his hip. His blue eyes, which had moments before held such warmth, were now cold and hard, like chips of ice. "I traded fairly for the blanket," Eli said, his voice dangerously low. "This woman can vouch for me." The trader, whose name Lila later learned was Silas Blackwood, sneered. "A woman's word, especially a Shoshone woman? Don't make me laugh." He spat on the ground, the gesture a clear sign of his contempt. The crowd that had gathered around them murmured, their eyes shifting between Eli, Lila, and Blackwood. The air crackled with tension, the festive atmosphere of the fair replaced by a sense of impending violence. Lila felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She knew the prejudice that existed, the deep-seated distrust of her people. Blackwood's accusation, fueled by that prejudice, could easily turn this into a deadly confrontation. Eli stood there, his gaze as unyielding as the mountains to the west. He knew this was more than just about the blanket, that he was at an impasse and his very life could be at stake. He wouldn't back down, Lila knew that much, even seeing his hardened expression. And neither would she. It began with dust and a promise, one the cowboy and the weaver held, and it wouldn't end easily. Lila looked from Silas to Eli, her jaw set, and knew she was about to step into a fray she wasn't prepared for, but had to all the same. She took a breath, a deep one, readying herself. Chapter 2. The Traitor's Accusation. "He's lying," Lila said, her voice rising above the murmur of the crowd. She stepped forward, placing herself between Eli and Silas Blackwood. "I traded Eli the blanket. He gave me a silver coin for it." Blackwood scoffed, his eyes narrowed. "A likely story. You probably conspired with him. You Shoshone are all alike thieves and liars." The insult stung, but Lila refused to back down. She had faced prejudice before, had learned to meet it with a quiet dignity, a strength that belied her slender frame. "I am not a thief," she said, her voice steady and clear, "and neither is he." She held out her hand, displaying the worn silver coin. "This is what he gave me. See for yourselves." The crowd pressed closer, their curiosity piqued. Some looked at the coin with suspicion, others with open hostility. The prejudice against the Shoshone was a palpable thing, a heavy weight in the air. Lila felt it pressing down on her, suffocating her. Eli stood silently beside her, his body taut, his hand still hovering near his knife. He didn't speak, didn't try to defend himself further. He seemed to understand, as Lila did, that words were useless against such ingrained hatred. Blackwood's two companions shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between the crowd and their boss. They were young, barely more than boys, and Lila sensed that they were not entirely comfortable with Blackwood's accusations. "Search him," Blackwood demanded, his voice harsh. "If he's got any more of my goods, you'll find them." The two young men hesitated, then at a sharp nod from Blackwood moved towards Eli. The crowd held its breath, the silence broken only by the rustle of clothing and the distant sounds of the fair. Eli didn't resist as the men patted him down, their hands rough and clumsy. They searched his pockets, his saddlebags, even his boots. They found nothing. Lila felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. Blackwood's face was still contorted with rage, his eyes burning with a hatred that went beyond the loss of a single blanket. "He must have hidden it," Blackwood insisted. "He's a clever one, this cowboy. He probably stashed it somewhere nearby." He turned to the crowd, his voice rising to a fever pitch. "Don't let him get away with this. He's a thief, and he needs to be punished." The crowd began to murmur again, their mood shifting. Blackwood's words, fueled by their own prejudices, were beginning to take hold. Lila saw the fear in their eyes, the fear of the unknown, the fear of anyone who was different. A man stepped forward, his face grim. He was the town marshal, a burly man with a weathered face and a star pinned to his vest. "All right, Blackwood," he said, his voice calm but firm. "That's enough. You've made your accusation, but you have no proof." Blackwood glared at the marshal. "I saw him steal it, I tell you. Are you going to let him get away with it just because he's got a Shoshone woman lying for him?" The marshal's eyes hardened. "I'm not taking sides," he said. "But I need evidence, Blackwood. And I'm not going to arrest a man based on your word alone. Then I'll take matters into my own hands, Black would snarl. He lunged towards Eli, his hand reaching for his revolver. Before anyone could react, Eli moved with lightning speed. He sidestepped Blackwood's attack, his hand flashing out and grabbing the trader's wrist. He twisted Blackwood's arm behind his back, forcing him to drop the revolver. The crowd gasped, their eyes wide with shock. The marshal stepped forward, his hand on his own gun. "Hold it right there, Tanner," he ordered. Eli held Blackwood in a tight grip, his eyes blazing with anger. But he didn't draw his knife. He didn't escalate the violence. He simply held Blackwood, preventing him from doing any further harm. "I didn't steal anything," Eli said, his voice low and controlled. "I traded fairly for the blanket. This woman is telling the truth." The marshal looked at Lila, his eyes searching. "Is that true, miss?" he asked. Lila nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes, sir," she said. "It's true. I traded him the blanket." The marshal hesitated, his gaze shifting between Eli and Blackwood. He seemed to be weighing his options, trying to decide what to do. The crowd was silent, waiting for his decision. Finally, the marshal sighed. "All right, Tanner," he said. "Release him. But I'm warning you, stay out of trouble." Eli slowly released Blackwood, his eyes never leaving the trader's face. Blackwood stumbled back, his face pale with fear and anger. He glared at Eli, his eyes filled with hatred. "This isn't over, cowboy," Blackwood hissed. "I'll get you for this. You and your Shoshone whore." The insult, raw and brutal, hung in the air. Lila flinched, her face burning with shame and anger. Eli's body tensed, his fists clenching. But before Eli could react, the marshal stepped between them. "That's enough, Blackwood," he said, his voice sharp. "Get out of here, and don't come back." Blackwood hesitated, then, with a final venomous glare at Eli and Lila, turned and stalked away, his two companions trailing behind him. The crowd began to disperse, their excitement over. The tension in the air slowly dissipated, replaced by a sense of unease. The marshal turned to Eli. "I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt, Tanner," he said. "But I'm watching you. Don't give me any reason to regret this." Eli nodded, his face grim. "I won't," he said. The marshal turned to Lila. "You too, miss," he said. "Stay out of trouble." Lila nodded, her heart still pounding. She felt shaken, humiliated, and angry. But she was also grateful. Grateful that Eli hadn't been arrested. Grateful that the situation hadn't escalated into further violence. As the marshal walked away, Eli turned to Lila, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft. Lila managed a weak smile. "I'm fine," she said. "Thank you for defending me." Eli shook his head. "You defended yourself," he said. "You were brave." Lila looked down at her hands, still trembling. She didn't feel brave. She felt scared and vulnerable. But she also felt a flicker of something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Eli reached out and gently touched her arm. His touch was warm and reassuring. "I'm sorry you got dragged into this," he said. "Blackwood is a dangerous man. He won't forget this." Lila looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. "I know," she said, "but I'm not afraid of him." Eli smiled, a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "I can see that," he said. "You're stronger than you think." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "I should go," he said. "I don't want to cause you any more trouble." Lila felt a pang of disappointment. She didn't want him to go. She wanted to know more about him, about the sadness she had seen in his eyes, about the stories he carried within him. "Will I see you again?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Eli hesitated, his gaze lingering on hers. "Maybe," he said, "if fate allows it." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the thinning crowd. Lila watched him go, her heart filled with a strange mixture of hope and apprehension. The dust swirled around her, carrying the scent of the prairie, the scent of promises made and broken, the scent of a future that was uncertain, yet filled with a glimmer of possibility. She clutched the silver coin in her hand, the metal warm against her skin. It was more than just a coin now. It was a link, a testament to a brief, intense encounter that had changed her life in ways she could yet foresee. She knew one thing: Blackwood would be back, and she would have to decide very soon what role Eli, the quiet cowboy, would play in that. She looked up at the vast, open sky, a question in her heart. Chapter 3. Whispers of the Past. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and deep bruised blue. The trading fair, once a hive of activity, gradually quieted. Campfires flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the wagons and tents. The smell of wood smoke mingled with the lingering aroma of cooked food and the ever-present scent of dust. Lila sat beside her own small fire, wrapped in one of her blankets. The encounter with Blackwood had left her shaken, her nerves frayed. She had sold a few more blankets, but her heart wasn't in it. Her thoughts kept returning to Eli, to his piercing blue eyes, to the quiet strength he exuded. She wondered about his past, about the loss she had sensed in him. She hadn't seen him since he'd walked away, disappearing into the crowd. She looked for him among the remaining people still walking around the fair, but he wasn't among them. A part of her, the practical part, told her to forget about him, to focus on her own survival. But another part, the part that yearned for connection, for something more, couldn't let go of the memory of their brief encounter. An old woman, her face a road map of wrinkles, approached Lila's fire. She was Shoshone from a different band, but Lila recognized the familiar patterns in her woven shawl, the stories told in the intricate designs. "You are Lila Redfeather, are you not?" the old woman asked, her voice raspy but kind. "Your mother was Willow Song." Lila nodded, surprised. "Yes," she said. "Did you know her?" The old woman smiled, a network of wrinkles deepening around her eyes. "I knew her well," she said. "She was a gifted weaver, a storyteller. She had the spirit of the ancestors in her hands." She sat down beside Lila, her movements slow and deliberate. "I saw what happened earlier," she said, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "With the trader, Blackwood." Lila felt a knot of tension tighten in her stomach. "He was lying," she said. "Eli didn't steal anything." The old woman nodded. "I know," she said. "Blackwood is a bad man. He has no honor." She paused, her gaze sweeping over Lila's blankets. "Your work is beautiful," she said. "You have your mother's gift." Lila felt a surge of warmth at the compliment. "Thank you," she said. "But be careful, child," the old woman said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Blackwood is not one to forgive or forget. He holds grudges like a viper holds its venom." Lila shivered despite the warmth of the fire. She knew the old woman was right. Blackwood's hatred had been palpable, his threat unmistakable. "What should I do?" Lila asked, her voice filled with apprehension. The old woman looked at her, her eyes filled with a wisdom that spanned generations. "Trust your instincts," she said, "and listen to the whispers of the past. They will guide you." She reached out and touched Lila's hand. "There is strength in you, child," she said. "The strength of your ancestors. Don't be afraid to use it." The old woman stood up, her movements stiff but graceful. "I must go," she said, "but I will be watching you. And so will the spirits of your ancestors." She melted away into the darkness, leaving Lila alone with her thoughts. The old woman's words, both comforting and unsettling, echoed in her mind. Listen to the whispers of the past. What did it mean? Lila looked at her blankets, at the stories woven into them. The stories of her people, of their struggles, their triumphs, their losses, the stories of the past. Suddenly she remembered something. A story her mother had told her. A story about a hidden cache of gold, a secret that had been passed down through generations. The gold had been hidden by a group of Shoshone warriors fleeing from the advancing U.S. cavalry. It was said to be cursed, guarded by the spirits of the dead. Lila had always dismissed the story as a legend, a fanciful tale. But now, in the flickering firelight, with the old woman's words ringing in her ears, she wondered if there might be some truth to it. Could Blackwood be after the gold? Was that why he had accused Eli of theft, hoping to drive him away, to clear the path for his own search? The thought sent a chill down her spine. If Blackwood was after the gold, he wouldn't hesitate to use violence to get it. And Eli, somehow, was caught in the middle. Lila felt a surge of determination. She couldn't let Blackwood win. She couldn't let him desecrate the memory of her ancestors, steal their sacred treasure. She had to do something, even if it meant risking her own life. She decided that night she would seek out more information. She looked up at the stars, pinpricks of light in the vast, inky blackness. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of the prairie, the scent of the past. She felt a connection to her ancestors, to the land, to the stories that flowed through her veins. She thought of Eli, of his quiet strength, of the sadness in his eyes. She didn't know why he had traded for the blanket, why he had chosen that particular story, but she knew with a certainty that surprised her that he was connected to the past, just as she was. She made a decision. She would find Eli. She would warn him about Blackwood, about the possible danger he was in. And she would ask him about the whispers of his own past. She knew very little about the man, but she knew that he was not what Silas made him out to be. She stood, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The night was cold, and the future uncertain. But Lila felt a newfound sense of purpose, a determination to protect her heritage, to uncover the truth, and perhaps to find a connection with the enigmatic cowboy who had walked into her life and stirred her soul. As she extinguished the remnants of her campfire, she made ready for the journey ahead. She did not know where it led, only that she must follow it. The prairie was vast, but she was no longer lost. She had a direction. Chapter 4, Beneath a Sky of Secrets. The dawn arrived, painting the eastern sky with streaks of pale gold and rose. Lila packed her remaining blankets and supplies, her movements quick and efficient. She had slept little, her mind racing with thoughts of Eli Blackwood and the old woman's cryptic words. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the promise of another dry, sunny day. She saddled her horse, a sturdy Appaloosa mare named Wind, a gift from her father before he had passed years before. Wind was her only companion on her solitary journeys, a loyal and reliable friend. Lila trusted the mare implicitly, knew that she could rely on her to navigate the treacherous terrain of the Wyoming plains. As Lila rode away from the remnants of the trading fair, she scanned the horizon, hoping to catch a glimpse of Eli. She had no idea where he might have gone, but she felt a pull, an intuition, guiding her towards the west, towards the towering peaks of the Wind River Mountains. The landscape was breathtakingly beautiful, a vast expanse of rolling hills and grassy plains, punctuated by rocky outcrops and deep canyons. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the sun warm on her back. But beneath the beauty, Lila sensed a lurking danger, a sense of unease that had settled over her since the encounter with Blackwood. She rode for several hours, stopping only to water wind and to rest for a few minutes. She saw no sign of Eli, but she pressed on, driven by a sense of urgency she couldn't explain. She kept replaying the moment when their hands met, that unexpected spark, the connection. She couldn't explain it, but it kept fueling her forward, one hoof step at a time. As she neared the foothills of the mountains, she spotted a plume of smoke rising in the distance. It was a small, thin column, barely visible against the vast backdrop of the sky. But it was a sign of human presence, a possible clue to Eli's whereabouts. Lila urged Wind towards the smoke, her heart beating faster. She approached cautiously, aware that it could be anyone, even Blackwood and his men. She kept her hand near the small knife she carried at her waist, a gift from her brother before he'd left to join a band of warriors, a decision that had broken her mother's heart. As she drew closer, she saw a small cabin nestled among a cluster of pine trees. It was a simple, rough-hewn structure, with a single window and a door made of rough planks. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, carrying the scent of burning pine and something else, something savory that made her stomach rumble. Lila dismounted, tying Wind to a nearby tree. She approached the cabin slowly, her senses on high alert. She heard the sound of someone chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of an axe against timber. She called out, her voice tentative. "Hello, is anyone there?" The chopping stopped. A moment of silence, then the door creaked open. Eli stood in the doorway, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw her. He was wearing the same clothes as the day before, but his hat was off, revealing a shock of thick, dark hair, streaked with silver at the temples. He held an axe in one hand, his other hand resting on the doorframe. "Lila?" he said, his voice a mixture of surprise and something else. Relief, concern? She couldn't quite decipher it. "Eli," she said, her voice catching in her throat. I needed to see you." He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "Come in," he said. "You're welcome here." The cabin was small and sparsely furnished, but it was clean and tidy. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, providing warmth and light. A pot hung over the flames, emitting the savory aroma Lila had smelled earlier. A bedroll was neatly arranged in one corner, and a few simple tools hung on the walls. "I was worried about you," Lila said, her voice still hesitant. "After what happened with Blackwood." Eli nodded, his expression grim. "He's a dangerous man," he said. "I knew he wouldn't let it go." He put down the axe and gestured towards a rough-hewn wooden stool near the fire. "Sit down," he said. "I was just making some stew." Lila sat, her gaze fixed on Eli. He moved with a quiet grace, his movements economical and efficient. He seemed at home in this rustic setting, as comfortable in the wilderness as he had been amidst the bustling chaos of the trading fair. "Why did you trade for that blanket?" Lila asked, her curiosity finally overcoming her apprehension. "The one with the story of the migration." Eli stirred the stew, his gaze fixed on the pot. "It reminded me of something," he said, his voice low. "Something I lost." He paused, his expression clouding over. "My family. We were traveling west years ago. We were attacked by bandits. I was the only survivor." Lila felt a pang of sympathy for him. She understood loss, the pain of losing loved ones, the emptiness that remained. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Eli looked up at her, his blue eyes filled with a deep sadness. "It was a long time ago," he said. "But the memory, it stays with you." He gestured towards the blanket, which he had carefully folded and placed on a small wooden chest. "That story, it spoke to me, of resilience, of survival, of the hope for a new beginning." Lila nodded, understanding now the yearning she had sensed in him, the desperate need that had driven him to trade his last silver coin for the blanket. "There's something else," Lila said, her voice hesitant. "Something I need to tell you." She told him about the old woman, about her cryptic words, about the whispers of the past. She told him about the legend of the hidden Shoshone gold, about her suspicion that Blackwood might be after it. Eli listened intently, his expression growing increasingly serious. "So you think Blackwood's accusation was a ruse?" he asked. "A way to get me out of the picture?" Lila nodded. "It's possible," she said. "He's greedy and ruthless. He wouldn't hesitate to steal from my people, to desecrate their sacred places." Eli's jaw tightened. "If he's after the gold," he said, "he'll stop at nothing to get it." He looked at Lila, his blue eyes filled with a newfound determination. "We need to stop him," he said. "We need to protect your people's heritage." Lila felt a surge of hope, a sense of shared purpose. She had come to Eli seeking help, seeking answers. And she had found something more, a partner, an ally, someone who understood her, who shared her values, who was willing to fight alongside her. "But how?" Lila asked, her mind racing. "We don't even know where the gold is hidden." Eli smiled, a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Maybe we don't," he said. "But I have a feeling that the whispers of the past will guide us." He knew more than he was saying, Lila could tell. But for now, that didn't matter. He looked at the stew pot on the fire. "Let's eat," he said. He ladled some stew into 2 tin bowls and handed one to Lila, sitting opposite her. As Lila started to eat, she knew one thing for sure. She and Eli were embarking on something dangerous but worthwhile. And she had a very strong feeling that the answers lie not only scattered across the plains, but within Eli himself. The sky outside was vast and full of secrets, much like her new companion. Chapter 5. The Weight of a Silver Coin. The stew was simple but nourishing, the warmth spreading through Lila's chilled body. The silence between her and Eli wasn't awkward, but rather a comfortable quiet, punctuated by the crackling fire and the occasional howl of a distant coyote. Lila found herself studying Eli, the lines etched around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when he spoke of Blackwood. He was a man of few words, but every word carried weight. Every glance held a depth of unspoken emotion. After they had finished eating, Eli rose and walked over to a small, worn wooden chest tucked beneath the window. He opened it and rummaged inside, pulling out a small, leather-bound book. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded. "This belonged to my father," he said, his voice soft. "He kept a journal of our journey west." He sat down beside Lila, opening the book carefully. He turned the pages, his fingers tracing the faded handwriting. "There's an entry here about the Shoshone," he said. "About a meeting with a group of warriors." Lila leaned closer, her heart beating faster. "What does it say?" she asked. Eli read aloud, his voice low and hesitant, as if he were deciphering a secret code. "We met with a band of Shoshone today, near the Wind River. They were wary but not hostile. Their leader, a man named Tall Bear, spoke of a sacred place, a place where they had hidden something of great value." Eli paused, his brow furrowed. "The writing is difficult to read here. It's smudged, but it mentions gold and spirits and a curse." Lila felt a shiver run down her spine. The journal entry confirmed her suspicions, confirmed the legend of the hidden gold. "Your father knew about it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Eli nodded. "It seems so," he said, "but he doesn't say where it is. Just that it's hidden in the heart of the mountains, guarded by the spirits of the dead." He closed the journal, his expression thoughtful. "I always thought it was just a story," he said. "Something my father made up to entertain me on the long journey. But it's not," Lila said. "It's real, and Blackwood knows about it." Eli's jaw tightened. We need to find it, he said. Before Blackwood does. But where do we start? Lila asked. The Wind River Mountains are vast. It could be anywhere. Eli looked at the blanket, the one he had traded for, and the one depicting the Shoshone migration. He traced the outline of the woven mountains, his fingers lingering on a particular peak, one that was slightly taller than the others. This peak, he said, his voice thoughtful. It looks familiar. I think I've seen it before. Lila studied the blanket, her eyes following Eli's finger. She recognized the peak, too. It was called Wind Rider's Peak, a sacred place for the Shoshone, a place where the spirits were said to dwell. Wind Rider's Peak, she said. It's a dangerous place. My people believe it's cursed. Eli nodded. My father wrote about a curse, he said. But I don't believe in curses. I believe in greed, and in the lengths people will go to satisfy it. He looked at Lila, his blue eyes intense. We need to go there, he said. We need to see if the gold is hidden there. Lila hesitated. She was afraid, not of the curse, but of Blackwood, of the violence he was capable of. But she also felt a sense of responsibility, a duty to protect her heritage, to honor the memory of her ancestors. All right, she said, her voice firm. We'll go, but we need to be careful. Eli smiled, a genuine smile this time, a smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. We will, he said. We'll watch each other's backs. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver coin, the one he had given Lila in trade for the blanket. He held it up, the worn eagle gleaming in the firelight. This coin, he said, his voice soft. It's more than just a piece of metal. It's a symbol of our connection, of our shared purpose. He handed the coin back to Lila. Keep it, he said, as a reminder of our promise. Lila took the coin, her fingers closing around it. The metal was warm from his touch, and she felt a surge of emotion, a feeling of gratitude, of trust, of something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. I will, she said, her voice trembling slightly. They spent the rest of the day making plans, studying the blanket, poring over Eli's father's journal, trying to glean any clues that might lead them to the hidden gold. They knew the journey would be perilous, that Blackwood would be watching them, waiting for an opportunity to strike. But they were determined, united by a shared purpose, bound by a silver coin and the whispers of the past. As darkness fell, Lila prepared to sleep. Eli offered her his bedroll, but she refused, insisting on sleeping on the floor near the fire. He didn't argue, understanding her need for independence, her reluctance to accept his hospitality. Before she slept, Lila took out the silver coin, holding it in her palm. She traced the outline of the eagle, her fingers lingering on the worn surface. The coin felt heavy, weighted with the significance of their agreement, with the danger that lay ahead. She looked at Eli, asleep on the floor across from her. He lay on his side, his face relaxed, his breathing even. He looked younger in sleep, less burdened by the weight of his past. She wondered, as she drifted off, what dreams he chased, what losses he carried in the quiet, unguarded moments of sleep. The fire crackled. The wind howled outside, but she felt surprisingly safe, secure in the knowledge that Eli was there and that they were in this together. The weight of the silver coin, a tangible link between them, was a comfort, a promise of protection, a symbol of a partnership forged in the crucible of danger. The next morning, Lila knew, would test that in the mountains. Chapter 6. Trails of Deception. The journey to Wind Rider's Peak began at first light. The air was frigid, a stark reminder of the approaching winter. Lila and Eli rode in silence, their breath misting in the cold air. The landscape grew increasingly rugged, the rolling hills giving way to steep, rocky slopes and dense forests of pine and aspen. Lila astride Wind, felt a sense of unease. The mountains were her home, yet they also felt alien, imbued with a sense of foreboding. She knew the legends, the stories of spirits and curses, and although she didn't fully believe them, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Eli, riding a strong, sure-footed buckskin, seemed unaffected by the ominous atmosphere. He scanned the horizon, his eyes constantly searching, alert to any sign of danger. He had a natural way with horses, Lila observed, a quiet confidence that communicated itself to the animal. "How did you learn to ride like that?" Lila asked, breaking the silence. Eli glanced at her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "My father taught me," he said. "He was a good horseman. He said a horse is a reflection of its rider, its spirit, its heart." "He sounds like he was a wise man," Lila said. Eli nodded, his expression clouding over. "He was," he said. "But wisdom doesn't always protect you from the cruelty of the world." They rode on, the silence returning, punctuated only by the sound of their horses' hooves on the rocky trail. Lila thought about Eli's father, about the journal, about the cryptic clues it contained. She wondered if they were on the right track, if they were chasing a phantom, a legend that had no basis in reality. As they climbed higher, the trees began to thin, revealing breathtaking views of the valley below. The sky was a vast azure dome, the sun a golden orb hanging low in the east. The air was thin and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the faint, earthy aroma of damp soil. Suddenly, Eli reined in his horse, his body tense. He pointed towards a narrow, rocky trail that branched off from the main path. "That's it," he said, his voice low. "That's the trail my father described, the one that leads to Wind Rider's Peak." Lila looked at the trail, her heart pounding. It was barely visible, overgrown with brush and strewn with rocks. It looked treacherous, almost impassable. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Eli nodded. "I'm sure," he said. "I recognize the landmarks from my father's description." He dismounted, handing his reins to Lila. "I'm going to scout ahead," he said. "See if it's safe." Lila watched him go, her apprehension growing. She didn't like the idea of him going alone, of being separated from him. But she knew he was right. He was more experienced, more skilled at navigating this kind of terrain. She waited, her hand resting on the hilt of her knife. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. She scanned the surrounding landscape, her senses on high alert. She saw nothing, but she felt a presence, a sense of being watched, that made the hairs on the back of her neck prickle. After what seemed like an eternity, Eli returned. His face was grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else, excitement. "The trail is passable," he said, "but it's not going to be easy, and—" He hesitated, his gaze meeting hers. "I found something." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished object. It was a silver button, embossed with the image of a coiled snake. Lila gasped. That's Blackwood's," she said. "I've seen him wear it, on his vest." Eli nodded. "He's been here," he said. "Recently?" A chill ran down Lila's spine. Blackwood was ahead of them. He was already searching for the gold. "We need to hurry," she said, her voice urgent. "We can't let him find it." Eli mounted his horse, his expression determined. "We won't," he said. "We're close. I can feel it." They started up the narrow trail, their horses struggling to maintain their footing on the loose rocks and steep inclines. The landscape grew increasingly wild, the trees sparse and stunted, the rocks jagged and unforgiving. As they rounded a bend, they saw it, Wind Rider's Peak. It towered above them, a massive, imposing monolith of rock, its summit shrouded in mist. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Lila felt a sense of dread, a feeling that they were trespassing on sacred ground, that they were venturing into a place where they didn't belong. But she pushed her fear aside. She had come too far to turn back now. She had a duty to protect her heritage, to honor the memory of her ancestors. And she had a promise to keep, a promise made to Eli, sealed with a silver coin. As they approached the base of the peak, they saw something that made their blood run cold. A makeshift camp, recently abandoned. A smoldering fire, a few scattered supplies, the unmistakable signs of Blackwood and his men. And then they saw something else. A narrow opening in the rock face, partially concealed by a large boulder. A cave. Eli's eyes met Lila's, a silent understanding passing between them. They had found it. The entrance to the hidden Shoshone gold, or so they thought. But they were not alone, and the knowledge weighed heavy. What lay waiting in the shadows of the cave, Lila did not know, but she knew one thing for sure. Blackwood had left a trail of deception, and they had walked right into it. The weight of the situation settled, with the dust of the trail. Chapter 7. Echoes in the Canyon. The air grew heavy with a palpable tension, a silence broken only by the whisper of the wind through the crags of Windrider's Peak. Lila and Eli dismounted, their movements cautious and deliberate. They tied their horses to a stunted pine tree well away from the cave entrance, ensuring they wouldn't be easily spotted. Eli drew his revolver, the metal gleaming in the fading sunlight. Lila loosened her knife in its sheath, her hand trembling slightly. They approached the cave entrance, slowly, their senses on high alert. "Stay close," Eli whispered, his voice barely audible. "And be ready for anything." The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to pass through. The air that emanated from within was cold and damp, carrying the scent of earth and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid. Eli stepped into the cave first, his revolver held ready. Lila followed close behind, her knife gripped tightly in her hand. The darkness enveloped them, the sunlight fading rapidly as they moved deeper into the earth. The cave was larger than it had appeared from the outside. The walls were rough and uneven, the floor strewn with rocks and debris. Water dripped from the ceiling, creating a constant, echoing drip, drip, drip. Eli moved slowly, his eyes scanning the darkness. He held his revolver up, using its faint glint to guide his way. Lila stayed close behind him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't see anyone," Eli whispered. "But they were here, recently." He pointed to a few scattered embers, the remnants of a small fire. A few empty food tins lay nearby, along with a discarded bedroll. "They must have heard us coming," Lila whispered. "They're hiding." Eli nodded, his expression grim. "Or they've gone deeper into the cave," he said. "This might be just the entrance to a larger system of tunnels." He moved further into the cave, his revolver leading the way. Lila followed, her senses straining to detect any sign of movement, any sound that might betray Blackwood's presence. The cave twisted and turned, branching off into several smaller passages. The darkness was almost complete, the silence broken only by the drip of water and the sound of their own breathing. Suddenly, Eli stopped. He held up his hand, signaling Lila to be quiet. He pointed towards one of the smaller passages, a narrow crevice in the rock face. "I hear something," he whispered. "Voices." Lila strained her ears, listening intently. At first she heard nothing. Then faintly she heard it. The murmur of voices, muffled and indistinct, coming from the depths of the passage. Eli motioned for Lila to stay back. He crept towards the passage, his revolver held ready. He peered around the corner, his body tense. Lila waited, her heart pounding. She felt a surge of fear, a premonition of danger. She wanted to call out to Eli, to tell him to come back, but she knew she couldn't. She had to trust him, to trust his instincts. A moment later, Eli returned. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "It's Blackwood," he whispered. "And his men. They're talking about the gold. They've found it." Lila felt a wave of despair wash over her. They were too late. Blackwood had beaten them. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Eli's jaw tightened. "We go in," he said. "We take it back." Lila hesitated. She knew the odds were against them. Blackwood had at least 2 men with him, possibly more. They were outnumbered, outgunned. But she also knew she couldn't give up. She couldn't let Blackwood steal her people's heritage, desecrate their sacred place. "All right," she said, her voice firm despite her fear. "Let's do it." Eli nodded, his eyes meeting hers. He gave her a faint, reassuring smile. "Stay close," he said, "and be ready for anything." They crept towards the passage, their movements slow and silent. The murmur of voices grew louder as they approached. They could hear Blackwood's voice, harsh and arrogant, boasting about his discovery. Eli peered around the corner again, his body tense. He quickly ducked back, his eyes blazing with anger. "They've got it," he whispered. "They're loading it onto their horses." He looked at Lila, his expression grim. "We need to create a distraction," he said. "Something to draw them away from the gold." Lila thought for a moment, her mind racing. She looked around the cave, her eyes searching for anything they could use. She spotted a pile of loose rocks near the entrance to the passage. An idea sparked in her mind. "I have an idea," she whispered. "But it's risky." She explained her plan to Eli, her voice low and urgent. He listened intently, his eyes narrowing in concentration. "It might work," he said. "But we need to be quick, and we need to be careful." They put their plan into action. Lila crept towards the pile of rocks, while Eli positioned himself near the entrance to the passage, his revolver ready. Lila took a deep breath, gathering her courage. Then, with all her might, she pushed the pile of rocks. The rocks tumbled down, creating a deafening roar that echoed through the cave. The voices in the passage stopped abruptly. "What was that?" Blackwood's voice roared. Eli stepped into the passage, his revolver firing. The shots echoed through the cave, mingling with the sound of falling rocks. Lila ran towards the passage, her knife drawn. She saw Blackwood and his men, startled and disoriented, their horses rearing in fear. The echoes of the mountains amplified every sound, multiplied every movement. The advantage, for the moment, seemed to rest on the side of surprise. The echoes, Lila realized, were on their side for the moment, but the moment wouldn't last. Chapter 8. The Price of Loyalty. The cavern erupted in chaos. Blackwood's men, caught off guard by the rock slide and Eli's sudden attack, scrambled for cover. Gunfire flashed in the dim light, bullets ricocheting off the cave walls. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the shouts of men. Lila, adrenaline surging through her veins, charged into the fray. She saw one of Blackwood's men aiming his revolver at Eli, his back turned to her. Without hesitation, she lunged, her knife flashing in the dim light. She struck him in the arm, her blade sinking deep into his flesh. The man screamed in pain, dropping his revolver. He turned on Lila, his eyes filled with rage. He was much larger than her, but Lila stood her ground, her knife held ready. Eli, seeing Lila's predicament, fired another shot, hitting the man in the leg. He crumpled to the ground, clutching his wound. Blackwood, his face contorted with fury, fired at Eli, but his shot went wide. Eli returned fire, forcing Blackwood to duck behind a large rock. "Get the gold!" Blackwood roared to his remaining man. "Get it out of here!" The man, a young wiry fellow with a desperate look in his eyes, scrambled towards the horses, which were laden with heavy sacks. He struggled to mount his horse, his movements hampered by the frightened animals. Lila saw her chance. She ran towards the man, her knife raised. She was faster than him, her movements agile and precise. She reached him just as he was about to mount his horse. She slashed at the ropes that secured the sacks to the horse's saddle. The ropes parted, and the sacks tumbled to the ground, spilling their contents. Gold coins, nuggets, and intricate Shoshone artifacts scattered across the cave floor. The sight of her people's sacred treasures, desecrated by Blackwood's greed, filled Lila with a renewed surge of anger. The young man turned on Lila, his eyes filled with desperation. He lunged at her, his hands outstretched, trying to grab her. Lila sidestepped his attack, her movements fluid and graceful. She struck him with the hilt of her knife, knocking him to the ground. He lay there, stunned and dazed. Eli, meanwhile, was engaged in a fierce gunfight with Blackwood. They exchanged fire from behind their respective covers, the bullets whizzing through the air. "You'll never get away with this, Blackwood," Eli shouted, his voice echoing through the cave. "You're a dead man, Tanner," Blackwood retorted, his voice filled with hatred. Lila, seeing that Eli was occupied, turned her attention back to the gold. She began to gather the scattered coins and artifacts, stuffing them back into the sacks. Suddenly she heard a shout. "Lila, look out!" It was Eli's voice, filled with warning. Lila turned, her heart leaping into her throat. Blackwood's injured man, the one she had stabbed in the arm and leg, was staggering towards her. A large rock clutched in his hand. He raised the rock above his head, his eyes filled with a murderous rage. Before Lila could react, the man brought the rock down on her head. A searing pain exploded in her skull, and she crumpled to the ground, her vision blurring. Eli, seeing Lila fall, roared in anger. He charged towards Blackwood's man, firing his revolver. The bullet struck the man in the chest, and he fell to the ground, dead. Eli rushed to Lila's side, his heart pounding with fear. He knelt beside her, gently cradling her head in his hands. "Lila! Lila, can you hear me?" he said, his voice filled with anguish. Lila's eyes fluttered open. She saw Eli's face, blurred and distorted, hovering above her. She felt a throbbing pain in her head, and her vision was swimming. "Eli?" she whispered, her voice weak. "Don't try to talk," Eli said, his voice trembling. "You're hurt, badly." He examined her head, his fingers gently probing the wound. He felt a large lump, and his fingers came away, covered in blood. He tore a strip of cloth from his shirt and pressed it against the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. Blackwood, seeing his chance, emerged from behind the rock. He aimed his revolver at Eli, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, a shot rang out. Blackwood staggered backward, his eyes widening in surprise. He clutched his chest, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. He crumpled to the ground, dead. Eli looked up, his eyes searching for the source of the shot. He saw the young, wiry man, the one Lila had knocked to the ground, standing near the entrance to the passage. He held a smoking revolver in his hand, his face pale and shaken. The young man lowered the revolver, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief. I couldn't let him kill you," he said, his voice trembling. I'm not like them." Eli stared at the young man, his mind racing. He didn't understand. Why had the man saved him? Why had he turned against Blackwood? "Who are you?" Eli asked, his voice hoarse. The young man hesitated, his gaze shifting towards Lila. "My name is Daniel," he said. And I'm Lila's brother." Eli's eyes widened in shock. He looked at Lila, then back at Daniel. The resemblance was there, he realized now. The same dark eyes, the same high cheekbones, the same proud bearing. It was something he couldn't quite process. "I ran away," he said, emotion in his voice. "Joined up with Blackwood for survival. I thought, but I—" He didn't finish. He simply knelt beside Lila, tears streaming down his face. Loyalty, it seemed, ran in different directions, and he had finally chosen his. Chapter 9. A stolen glance, a hidden truth. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Eli, still reeling from the near-death experience and the shock of Daniel's confession, struggled to process the information. Lila's brother? The man who had been working for Blackwood? The man who had almost killed them? Daniel knelt beside Lila, his face etched with guilt and sorrow. He gently stroked her hair, his hand trembling. "I'm so sorry, Lila," he whispered. I never wanted to hurt you." Lila remained unconscious, her breathing shallow and uneven. Eli checked her pulse, his heart pounding with fear. It was weak, but still there. "We need to get her out of here," Eli said, his voice urgent. "She needs help." Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "I'll help you," he said. "I know a place, a safe place, where we can take her." He looked at Eli, his expression pleading. "Please," he said. "Trust me. I know I don't deserve it, but please. I want to make things right." Eli hesitated. He didn't trust Daniel, not completely. But he saw the genuine remorse in his eyes, the desperation in his voice. And he saw the resemblance to Lila, the undeniable connection between them. He has saved Lila's life, and that was enough. "All right," Eli said, his voice grudging. "But I'm watching you. One wrong move, and—" He didn't finish the threat, but Daniel understood. He nodded solemnly, his gaze fixed on Lila. Together they carefully lifted Lila, carrying her out of the cave and into the fading daylight. The air was cold, but the sun was still shining, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. They loaded Lila onto Eli's horse, securing her carefully. Daniel mounted his own horse, the one he had been about to ride away on with the stolen gold. The sacks of gold and artifacts lay scattered on the ground, forgotten for the moment. "Where are we going?" Eli asked, his voice wary. "To a hidden valley," Daniel said. "Not far from here. It's a place, a sacred place, for my people. No one will find us there." He led the way, guiding them along a narrow, winding trail that led deeper into the mountains. Eli followed close behind, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding landscape. As they rode, Daniel began to tell his story. He spoke of his childhood, of his family, of his decision to leave his home and join a band of warriors. He spoke of his disillusionment with that life, of his decision to join up with Blackwood, hoping for a chance at a better future. He spoke of his regret, of his shame, of his longing to return to his people, to his sister. "I never wanted to hurt Lila," he said, his voice choked with emotion. I just wanted to survive. But I was wrong. I was so wrong." Eli listened, his initial suspicion slowly giving way to a grudging respect. He saw the pain in Daniel's eyes, the genuine remorse that consumed him. He realized that Daniel was just a young man, caught in a desperate situation, trying to find his way in a harsh and unforgiving world. They reached the hidden valley as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the surrounding peaks. It was a beautiful, secluded place, a small oasis of green nestled among the towering rocks. A stream flowed through the valley, its waters clear and cold. They dismounted, carefully lifting Lila from Eli's horse. They carried her to a small, sheltered cave near the stream, a place that seemed untouched by the outside world. Daniel gathered wood and built a fire while Eli tended to Lila's wound. He cleaned it as best he could, using water from the stream and a clean cloth torn from his shirt. He applied a makeshift bandage, trying to stop the bleeding. Lila remained unconscious, her breathing still shallow and uneven. Eli sat beside her, holding her hand, his heart filled with a mixture of fear and something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time, a tenderness, a protectiveness, a growing affection for this brave, resilient woman. As darkness fell, Daniel returned with a handful of herbs. "These will help," he said, his voice hesitant. They're healing herbs. My mother taught me how to use them." He crushed the herbs and mixed them with water, creating a paste. He gently applied the paste to Lila's wound, his touch surprisingly gentle. Eli watched him, his initial suspicion fading. He saw the care in Daniel's eyes, the genuine concern for his sister's well-being. He realized that Daniel was not his enemy, that he was, in fact, an ally. They sat beside Lila throughout the night, taking the turns watching over her, keeping the fire burning, praying for her recovery. The silence was broken only by the crackling fire, the murmur of the stream, and the occasional howl of a distant coyote. As Eli sat and the night went on, he stared at the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. He was a changed man, he knew that. He had been running from emotion, from feeling. Lila had awoken a part of him, long since numbed. He caught Daniel staring at him, a long look. Daniel seemed about to speak, but merely looked down and continued tending to his sister. It was a silent, unexplainable moment, stolen between the two, but full of meaning that would have to wait. Eli looked at Lila now, wondering if she'd survive. The hidden truth of his feeling for her, and Daniel's hidden truth of his past. Those were things that could wait. For now, Chapter 10, Scars of the Heart. The first rays of dawn crept into the hidden valley, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and gold. Lila stirred, a low moan escaping her lips. Eli, who had been dozing fitfully beside her, was instantly alert. He leaned over her, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. "Lila?" he said softly, his hand gently touching her cheek. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing her dark, luminous eyes, now clouded with pain and confusion. She blinked, trying to focus on Eli's face. "Eli," she whispered, her voice weak and raspy. What happened?" "You were hurt," Eli said, his voice filled with relief. "Blackwood's man, he hit you with a rock." Lila's hand went to her head, her fingers gingerly touching the bandage. She winced in pain. "Daniel," she whispered, her eyes searching the small cave. Where is he?" Eli gestured towards the entrance of the cave, where Daniel was tending to the fire, his back turned to them. "He's here," Eli said. He saved us, Lila. He killed Blackwood." Lila's eyes widened in surprise. She struggled to sit up, but Eli gently pushed her back down. "Don't try to move," he said. "You need to rest." Daniel turned and walked towards them, his expression hesitant, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and hope. He knelt beside Lila, his hand reaching out to touch her, but then stopping as if he were afraid. "Lila," he said, his voice choked with emotion. I'm so sorry for everything." Lila looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and something else. Recognition? Forgiveness? It was hard to tell. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice weak. You saved us?" Daniel nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I had to," he said. "I couldn't let them hurt you. Not anymore." He told her everything, about his time with Blackwood, about his regret, about his decision to turn against him. He spoke of his longing to return to his people, to his family, to her. Lila listened, her eyes never leaving his face. She saw the pain in his eyes, the genuine remorse that consumed him. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "I forgive you, Daniel," she said, her voice stronger now. "You're my brother, and I'm glad you're back." Daniel broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. He buried his face in Lila's shoulder, his body shaking with emotion. Eli watched them, his heart filled with a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that Lila was alive, gratitude for Daniel's actions, and a growing sense of something he couldn't quite define. After a while, Daniel's sobbing subsided. He lifted his head, his eyes red and swollen. He looked at Eli, his expression apologetic. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse, for trusting me, for giving me a chance." Eli nodded, his expression softening. "You earned it," he said. "You saved Lila's life. You saved both our lives." Oh, they spent the day in the hidden valley, tending to Lila's wounds, resting and talking. Lila slowly regained her strength, her memory of the events in the cave returning in fragments. She remembered the fight, the gold, Blackwood's attack, and Daniel's intervention. She also remembered Eli, his bravery, his protectiveness, his tenderness. She looked at him now, seeing him in a new light. He was more than just a cowboy, and more than just an ally. He was a man of courage, of compassion, of deep, unspoken emotions. As the day wore on, Lila and Daniel began to reconnect, their bond as siblings slowly reforming. They talked about their childhood, about their parents, about the life they had shared before Daniel had left. They spoke of their hopes, their dreams, their fears. Eli watched them, feeling a sense of exclusion, but also a sense of contentment. He was glad that Lila and Daniel had found each other again, that they had begun to heal the wounds of the past. He also realized that he was an outsider, that he didn't belong in this intimate family circle. He had played his part, he had helped them, but now it was time for him to move on. As evening approached, Eli made a decision. He would leave the hidden valley, leave Lila and Daniel to rebuild their lives, to forge a new future together. He announced his decision to them, his voice calm and resolute. "I'll be going now," he said. "You two need time to be together, to heal." Lila looked at him, her eyes filled with surprise and something else. Disappointment? Sadness? "But where will you go?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Eli shrugged. "I don't know," he said. "West, maybe. Find some work, start over." He looked at her, his blue eyes intense. "You'll be all right," he said. "You have Daniel now. You have each other." He stood up, gathering his belongings. He looked at Daniel, extending his hand. "Take care of your sister," he said, his voice firm. Daniel shook his hand, his grip strong. "I will," he said. "And thank you, Eli, for everything." Eli nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He turned to Lila, his gaze lingering on hers. "Goodbye, Lila," he said, his voice soft. Lila stood up, her body still weak, but her spirit strong. She reached out and touched his arm, her fingers lingering on his skin. "Goodbye, Eli," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And thank you." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Lila watched him go, her heart aching with a sense of loss, a sense of something she couldn't quite name. It was more than just gratitude, she knew. It was something deeper, something that had taken root in her heart during their brief, intense time together. Daniel put his arm around Lila, his touch comforting. "He's a good man, Lila," he said. "He'll be all right." Lila nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that a part of her was walking away with Eli, that a chapter of her life was closing, leaving a void that she didn't know how to fill. The scars of the past, both hers and Eli's, were still there, raw and painful. But she also knew that healing was possible, that hope remained, that the future, though uncertain, held the promise of new beginnings. But for now, she couldn't think of a new beginning without Eli, and that scared her. Chapter 11. The Dance of Shadows. Eli rode through the night, the vast, starlit sky his only companion. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to put distance between himself and the hidden valley, between himself and Lila. The image of her face, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness, haunted him. He pushed his horse onward as if trying to physically outrun his feelings, but emotions, he found, were faster than any steed. He had tried to convince himself that he was doing the right thing, that Lila was better off with her brother, that he was an outsider, a drifter, who didn't belong in her world. But the truth was, he was running away from the feelings that Lila had awakened in him, feelings he had long suppressed, feelings he was afraid to confront. He had lived a solitary life marked by loss and hardship. He had learned to protect himself, to build walls around his heart, to avoid emotional attachments. But Lila had breached those walls, had touched something deep within him, something he thought had died long ago. He admitted it now in the solitude of the ride. He was falling in love with her. As dawn approached, he found himself near a small, dusty town nestled at the foot of the mountains. He was tired, hungry, and his horse needed rest. He decided to stop to replenish his supplies and to try to make sense of the turmoil within him. The town was typical of the Wild West, a collection of rough-hewn buildings lining a single, dusty street. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith shop, a few ramshackle houses. The air was thick with the smell of dust, horses, and stale beer. Eli stabled his horse and walked towards the saloon, hoping for a strong cup of coffee and something to eat. As he entered, he was met with the usual stares, the curious glances of the locals assessing the newcomer. The saloon was dimly lit, the air thick with smoke. A few cowboys were huddled around a table playing cards. A lone piano player was tinkling out a melancholic tune. The bartender, a burly man with a handlebar mustache, wiped down the counter with a rag. Eli sat at the bar, ordering coffee and a plate of bacon and eggs. He ate slowly, his mind still preoccupied with Lila. He wondered how she was doing, if she was recovering from her injuries, if she and Daniel were truly reconciling. As he was finishing his meal, he heard a commotion at the entrance of the saloon. He looked up, his hand instinctively moving towards his revolver. 3 men entered, their faces hard, their eyes scanning the room. They wore the garb of cowboys, but there was something about them, something menacing, that set them apart. They carried themselves with an arrogance, a swagger, that suggested trouble. Eli recognized them instantly. They were Blackwood's men, the ones who had been with him in the cave, the ones who had escaped. They hadn't seen him yet. They were talking to the bartender, their voices low and urgent. Eli couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could sense their anger, their frustration. He knew they were looking for him, for Lila, for revenge. Blackwood might be dead, but his legacy of hatred lived on. Eli finished his coffee, his mind racing. He needed to get out of there to avoid a confrontation. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, to put the townspeople at risk. He stood up, preparing to leave. But as he turned, he saw them. The 3 men were walking towards him, their eyes fixed on him, their hands hovering near their guns. "Well, well, well," one of them said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look what we have here. The hero cowboy." Eli stood his ground, his body tense, his hand still near his revolver. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Too late for that," another man said, his hand dropping to the butt of his gun. "You killed our boss. You're going to pay for that." The saloon went silent. The card players stopped their game. The piano player stopped playing. The bartender froze, his hand still clutching the rag. All eyes were on Eli and the three men. Eli knew he was in a dangerous situation. He was outnumbered, outgunned. But he wouldn't back down. He wouldn't let these men intimidate him. Blackwood was a murderer and a thief, Eli said, his voice steady. He deserved what he got. That's for us to decide, the third man said, his hand tightening on his gun. And we've decided you're gonna die. The three men drew their revolvers, their movements quick and practiced. Eli reacted instantly, his hand flashing to his own gun. The saloon erupted in gunfire. Bullets whizzed through the air, shattering glasses, splintering wood, embedding themselves in the walls. Eli ducked behind the bar, using it as cover. He fired his revolver, hitting one of the men in the shoulder. The man screamed in pain, dropping his gun. The other two men continued to fire, their bullets peppering the bar. Eli returned fire, forcing them to take cover behind a table. The gunfight was brief but intense. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the screams of the wounded, the shouts of the terrified onlookers. Eli, using his skill and experience, managed to outmaneuver his opponents. He shot one man in the leg, disabling him. The third man, seeing that he was outmatched, tried to flee, but Eli shot him in the back as he ran towards the door. The saloon fell silent. The only sound the groans of the wounded men. Eli emerged from behind the bar, his revolver still smoking. The townspeople stared at him, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Eli had single-handedly taken down 3 armed men. He had saved their lives, their town. But Eli felt no sense of triumph, no sense of satisfaction. He felt only a deep weariness, a profound sadness. He was tired of the violence, tired of the killing, tired of the constant struggle for survival. He yearned for peace, for a life free from fear and bloodshed. He yearned for Lila. The dance of shadows he had performed in the saloon, it was nothing new. It was a dance he knew well, a dance of death. But he knew that this dance was different. It was a dance for Lila, even if she never knew. Chapter 12. Between Two Worlds. The aftermath of the saloon shootout left Eli shaken, but resolute. The townspeople, initially stunned into silence, erupted into a flurry of activity. The marshal, alerted by the gunfire, arrived to take charge, arresting the wounded men and arranging for their medical care. He questioned Eli, who recounted the events truthfully, omitting only Lila and Daniel's involvement, referring to the cave incident as a prior, separate encounter with Blackwood. The townspeople, grateful for Eli's intervention, hailed him as a hero. They offered him food, drink, a place to stay. But Eli declined their offers, his mind elsewhere. He retrieved his horse from the stable, his thoughts consumed by Lila. He knew he couldn't stay, not with Blackwood's men still at large, potentially seeking revenge. He needed to find Lila, to make sure she was safe, to what? He hadn't allowed himself to fully consider that question. He rode out of town, the setting sun casting long shadows across the plains. He had no clear destination, only a vague sense of needing to return to the mountains, to the hidden valley where he had left Lila and Daniel. He rode with a sense of urgency, a feeling that time was running out, that danger was still lurking. Meanwhile, back in the hidden valley, Lila was slowly recovering from her injuries. Daniel's knowledge of traditional Shoshone medicine, combined with her own resilience, proved effective. The wound on her head was healing, and her strength was returning. But her physical recovery was overshadowed by an emotional turmoil. Eli's departure had left a void in her life, a sense of emptiness that she couldn't shake. She found herself constantly thinking about him, wondering where he was, if he was safe, if he ever thought of her. She and Daniel had spent the days following Eli's departure rebuilding their relationship, forging a new bond based on shared loss, forgiveness, and a renewed commitment to their heritage. They had retrieved the Shoshone gold and artifacts from the cave, returning them to a secret location within the hidden valley, a place known only to them. Daniel had confessed everything to Lila, revealing the full extent of his involvement with Blackwood, his participation in the theft of the Shoshone treasures. He expressed his deep remorse, his shame, his determination to make amends for his past actions. Lila, though initially hurt and angry, had forgiven him. She saw the genuine change in him, the sincerity of his repentance. She understood the desperation that had driven him to make bad choices, the harsh realities of survival in the unforgiving landscape of the Wild West. But despite the reconciliation with her brother, Lila couldn't shake the feeling of incompleteness, the sense that something was missing. She missed Eli's quiet strength, his gentle nature, his unwavering support. She missed the connection she had felt with him, the spark that had ignited between them during their brief, intense time together. She found herself walking to the edge of the valley, gazing out at the vast expanse of mountains and plains, searching for a sign, a glimpse of the man who had ridden out of her life as suddenly as he had entered it. She questioned whether she was right to let him go if she should have held on to something that felt so powerful. One evening, as she sat by the fire with Daniel, she finally voiced her feelings. "I miss him, Daniel," she said, her voice soft and filled with sadness. "I miss Eli." Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with understanding. He had seen the connection between Lila and Eli, the unspoken attraction that had blossomed between them. He had also sensed Eli's hesitation, his reluctance to fully embrace his feelings for Lila. "He's a good man, Lila," Daniel said. "But he's carrying a lot of baggage. He's seen a lot of pain, a lot of loss." "I know," Lila said. "But I felt something with him, Daniel, something I've never felt before." Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "I saw it," he said. "But love in this world, Lila, it's not easy. It's often mixed with danger, with heartbreak." Lila sighed, her heart heavy. She knew Daniel was right. Life on the frontier was precarious, filled with uncertainty and risk. Love was a luxury, a vulnerability that could easily be exploited. She felt torn, caught between two worlds, the world of her ancestors, of her people, of her heritage, a world that Daniel represented, and the world of the unknown, a possibility of a love that transcended cultural boundaries, a world that Eli represented. She stood up, walking to the edge of the cave, gazing out at the star-filled sky. She felt a longing, a yearning for something more, something beyond the confines of her current existence. She felt a pull towards Eli, a desire to see him again, to know if the feelings she had for him were reciprocated. She, like Eli, had been running from something. But she also knew that running wasn't the answer. It was time to be brave. She knew that, and she knew what she had to do, even if it meant potential heartbreak. Chapter 13. A Flame in the Darkness. Lila made her decision with the rising sun. She would leave the hidden valley, leave the safety and comfort of a reunited family, and seek out Eli. She knew the risks, the dangers that awaited her in the outside world, but she couldn't ignore the pull she felt, the undeniable connection that bound her to the quiet cowboy. She explained her decision to Daniel, her voice firm, but filled with a hint of trepidation. "I need to find him, Daniel," she said. "I need to know if what I felt real." Daniel, though initially concerned for her safety, understood. He had seen the spark between Lila and Eli, the unspoken bond that had formed between them. He also knew that Lila was a strong, independent woman, capable of making her own choices, of facing her own challenges. "I understand, Lila," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "But be careful. The world out there, it's not always kind." He offered to accompany her, to protect her, but Lila refused. This was a journey she needed to make alone, a quest to find not only Eli, but also herself. "I'll be all right, Daniel," she said, her voice reassuring. "I know how to take care of myself." She embraced her brother, a long, heartfelt embrace that conveyed all the unspoken emotions between them. Forgiveness, gratitude, love. "Come back to me, Lila," Daniel said, his voice choked with emotion. "Come back safe." "I will," Lila promised, her eyes filled with tears. She saddled Win, her trusty Appaloosa, and packed a small bag with supplies, food, water, a blanket, her knife. She also took the silver coin, the one Eli had given her, the one that symbolized their connection, their shared purpose. She held it in her palm, the metal warm against her skin, drawing strength from its presence. She rode out of the hidden valley, the rising sun casting a golden glow over the landscape. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to follow her heart, to trust her instincts, to find the man who had captured her soul. She rode for days, following the faint trails, the whispers of the wind, the guidance of the stars. She encountered few people, mostly travelers and traders, wary and cautious, their eyes filled with the hardships of frontier life. She asked about Eli, describing him to anyone she met, hoping for a clue, a sign, a direction. But no one had seen him. No one knew of a cowboy matching his description. Doubt began to creep into her mind. Was she chasing a phantom, a dream that had no basis in reality? Was Eli even still alive? Had Blackwood's men found him, taken their revenge? She pushed those thoughts aside, refusing to give up hope. She had come too far, sacrificed too much, to turn back now. She had to believe that Eli was out there, somewhere, waiting for her. One evening, as she was setting up camp near a small, dried-up creek bed, she saw it. A flicker of light in the distance, a faint glow against the darkening sky. Her heart leaped with hope. It could be anyone, she knew, but she couldn't ignore the possibility, the chance that it might be Eli. She quickly extinguished her own small fire, not wanting to draw unwanted attention. She mounted Wind and rode towards the light, her senses on high alert. As she drew closer, she saw that the light came from a small cabin, nestled among a cluster of pine trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the scent of burning wood and something else, something familiar, the scent of stew, the same stew Eli had made for her in his cabin. Her heart pounded in her chest. She dismounted, tying Wind to a nearby tree. She approached the cabin cautiously, her hand resting on the hilt of her knife. She peered through the window, her breath catching in her throat. Eli was there. He was sitting by the fire, his back to the window, his head bowed. He looked tired, weary, his shoulders slumped with a weight she couldn't fathom. Lila hesitated, her hand hovering over the door. She was afraid of rejection, afraid of finding out that her feelings were not reciprocated. But she couldn't turn back now. She had come too far, risked too much, to let fear hold her back. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. She knocked on the door, her knuckles rapping against the rough wood. The sound echoed in the silence. Eli startled, his head jerking up. He turned towards the door, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw her silhouette through the window. He rose slowly, his movements hesitant, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. He walked towards the door, his hand reaching for the latch. He opened the door, his blue eyes searching hers, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something else. Hope? Longing? "Lila," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Is that really you?" Lila nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "It's me, Eli," she said, her voice trembling. I came to find you." A flicker of emotion crossed Eli's face, a flicker of relief, joy? It was hard to tell, but it was enough. It was a flame in the darkness, a sign that her journey had not been in vain, and neither had his. The question now was what they would do with this second chance. Chapter 14, The Reckoning Wind. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Eli stood in the doorway, his gaze locked on Lila's, his expression unreadable. The firelight flickered behind him, casting dancing shadows on his face, highlighting the lines of weariness and something else, something that made Lila's heart ache. I didn't expect," Eli stammered, his voice rough with emotion. He seemed at a loss for words, his usual composure shattered. Lila stepped forward, crossing the threshold, entering the small cabin. "I had to come," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I had to see you." Eli closed the door behind her, shutting out the cold night air. He turned to face her, his blue eyes searching hers as if trying to decipher the truth of her words. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why did you come?" Lila took a deep breath, gathering her courage. She had come this far. She wouldn't hold back now. "Because I couldn't stay away," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Because I care about you, Eli. More than I thought possible." The words hung in the air, heavy with significance. Eli's expression softened, his eyes losing some of their guardedness. A flicker of warmth, of hope, ignited within them. He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. His fingers were calloused, but his touch sent a shiver of warmth through her. "Lila," he said, his voice choked with emotion. I didn't think—" He couldn't finish the sentence, his voice failing him. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the fire. Lila squeezed his hand, her heart aching for him. She saw the pain in his eyes, the burden of his past, the weight of his loneliness. "I know," she said softly. "I know you've been through a lot, but you don't have to be alone anymore, Eli." He looked back at her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of longing and fear. He was afraid to hope, afraid to believe that he deserved happiness, that he deserved her. "I've lived a hard life, Lila," he said, his voice rough. "I've seen things, done things, that I'm not proud of." "We all have," Lila said, her voice firm. "We all have scars, Eli. But they don't define us. They don't determine our future." She reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the lines etched by hardship and time. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a moment, as if savoring the simple act of human connection. I care about you too, Lila," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "More than I ever thought possible." He opened his eyes, his gaze locking on hers. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by something else, something stronger, something that had been growing between them, despite the distance, despite the danger, despite the scars of their pasts. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. Lila rested her head against his chest, her heart overflowing with emotion. She felt his warmth, his strength, his vulnerability. She felt his love. They stood there for a long time, embraced in the silence of the small cabin, the firelight flickering around them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. It was a moment of peace, of connection, of healing, a moment where two wounded souls found solace in each other's arms. But the peace was shattered by a sudden, violent gust of wind that rattled the cabin walls, shaking the windows, extinguishing the fire. The darkness enveloped them, sudden and complete. Eli pushed Lila behind him, his hand instinctively reaching for his revolver. "Stay down," he whispered, his voice tense. "Stay quiet." He peered through the window, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. He saw nothing, but he felt it. A presence, a sense of impending danger. The wind howled, a mournful cry that echoed through the surrounding trees. It was more than just a wind, Lila realized. It was a reckoning wind, a harbinger of something dark, something ominous. Suddenly, a voice cut through the darkness, amplified by the wind. "Tanner, we know you're in there. Come out and face us." Eli's jaw tightened. He recognized the voice. It was one of Blackwood's men, the ones who had survived the shootout in the saloon. They had found him. "They've come for revenge," Eli whispered, his voice grim. "They won't give up." Lila felt a surge of fear, but also a surge of determination. She wouldn't let these men hurt Eli, not again. She wouldn't let them destroy the fragile peace they had found. "We'll fight them," she said, her voice firm. "Together." Eli looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and love. He knew she was right. They had to fight. They had to stand together against the darkness, against the reckoning wind that threatened to consume them. They prepared, a deadly storm brewing outside, a storm that mirrored the one inside. Love, rage, fear, and bravery. Chapter 15. Broken bonds, shattered dreams. Eli quickly relit the fire, the small flame casting a flickering, defiant glow in the darkness. He checked his revolver, making sure it was fully loaded. Lila grabbed her knife, the familiar weight of it comforting in her hand. "Stay behind me," Eli said, his voice low and urgent. "Don't come out unless I tell you to." Lila nodded, her heart pounding. She knew the danger, the odds against them. But she trusted Eli, and she trusted her own instincts. The voice outside called out again, closer this time, more menacing. "Tanner, we're not playing games. Come out, or we'll burn you out." Eli peered through the window, his eyes scanning the darkness. He saw 3 figures, silhouetted against the faint light of the rising moon. They were armed with rifles and torches, their faces hidden in the shadows. "They mean business," Eli whispered. "They'll set the cabin on fire." He knew they couldn't stay inside. They would be trapped, easy targets. They had to go out to face their attackers, to fight for their survival. He looked at Lila, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of determination and regret. He had hoped for a peaceful life with her, a life free from violence, from the ghosts of his past. But that dream was shattered, at least for now. "Ready?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lila nodded, her gaze meeting his. "Ready?" she said, her voice firm. Eli took a deep breath, steeling himself. He kicked open the door, charging out into the night, his revolver blazing. The sudden attack caught Blackwood's men by surprise. Eli's bullets found their mark, hitting one of the men in the chest. He fell to the ground, his torch dropping, the flames sputtering out. The other 2 men returned fire, their bullets whizzing past Eli, splintering the wooden frame of the cabin. Eli ducked behind a tree, using it as cover. Lila, following Eli's instructions, stayed inside the cabin, peering through the window, her knife gripped tightly in her hand. She saw the muzzle flashes of the rifles, the shadowy figures moving in the darkness. She saw one of the men circling around the cabin, trying to get a clear shot at Eli. She knew she had to do something to help him. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. She slipped out of the cabin, moving silently along the wall, staying in the shadows. She crept up behind the man, her movements swift and silent. He was focused on Eli, his rifle aimed, his finger tightening on the trigger. Lila lunged, her knife flashing in the moonlight. She struck him in the back, her blade sinking deep into his flesh. The man screamed in pain, dropping his rifle. He turned on Lila, his eyes filled with rage and surprise. He was much larger than her, but Lila stood her ground, her knife held ready. Before the man could attack, Eli shot him. The bullet struck him in the chest, and he fell to the ground, dead. Eli turned his attention to the remaining man who was now firing at him from behind a stack of firewood. Eli returned fire, forcing the man to take cover. The gunfight continued, the sound of gunfire echoing through the night. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the scent of burning wood. Suddenly, Lila heard a shout from behind her. "You Shoshone witch!" She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. It was the man she had stabbed in the back. He was still alive, his face contorted with pain and fury. He was staggering towards her, a large rock clutched in his hand. Before Lila could react, the man raised the rock above his head, preparing to strike. But before he could bring it down, a shot rang out. The man staggered backward, his eyes widening in surprise. He clutched his chest, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. He crumpled to the ground, dead. Lila looked up, her eyes searching for the source of the shot. She saw Eli standing near the tree, his revolver still smoking. He had saved her life again. But Eli's face was pale, his eyes filled with horror. He wasn't looking at Lila, he was looking past her, at something behind her. Lila turned, her blood running cold. Standing near the edge of the clearing, his rifle aimed at Eli, was Daniel. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes burning with hatred. "Daniel?" Lila whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. What are you doing?" Daniel didn't answer. He simply stared at Eli, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Daniel, no!" Lila screamed. "Don't do it!" But it was too late. Daniel fired. The bullet struck Eli in the chest, sending him sprawling backward. He landed hard on the ground, his body still, his eyes open and staring blankly at the sky. Lila screamed again, a primal scream of anguish and despair. She ran to Eli's side, dropping to her knees, cradling his head in her hands. Eli, no, please don't be dead," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face. She felt for a pulse, her fingers desperately searching for a sign of life. But there was nothing. Eli was gone. Daniel lowered his rifle, his face still a mask of cold fury. He walked towards Lila, his boots crunching on the dry leaves. "He deserved it," Daniel said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He was going to take you away from me, from us, from our people." Lila looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief and horror. She couldn't believe what she was hearing, what she was seeing. Her own brother, the man she had forgiven, the man she had trusted, had just murdered the man she loved. The bonds of family, the dreams of a future together, all shattered in an instant. The reckoning wind had come, and it had taken everything from her. The night echoed with her heartbroken cries, a symphony of shattered dreams and broken bonds. Chapter 16, Where the River Bends. Lila's world crumbled around her. The man she loved lay dead at her feet, murdered by her own brother. The grief was a physical blow, a crushing weight that stole her breath and blurred her vision. She knelt beside Eli, cradling his lifeless body, her tears falling onto his still face. Daniel stood over them, his rifle still in his hand, his expression unreadable. He showed no remorse, no regret, only a cold, hard satisfaction. "He was an outsider, Lila," Daniel said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He didn't belong here. He didn't belong with us." Lila looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief, disbelief, and a growing, burning rage. "He was everything to me, Daniel," she said, her voice trembling with raw emotion. "And you killed him." Daniel shrugged, his shoulders moving in a gesture of indifference. "He was a threat," he said. "A threat to our people, to our way of life." "He was not a threat," Lila screamed. her voice echoing through the clearing. "He loved me. He would have done anything for me. For us." Daniel's expression hardened. "You're blinded by your feelings, Lila," he said. "You don't see the truth. He would have taken you away from your family, from your heritage. He would have made you forget who you are." "You're wrong," Lila said, her voice shaking with anger. "He understood me. He respected my heritage. He embraced it. He was more of a brother to you than you ever were to me." The words stung, even to Daniel's seemingly impenetrable facade. A flicker of pain crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by his cold mask. "You're grieving," he said, his voice dismissive. "You don't know what you're saying." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Lila alone with Eli's body and the shattered remnants of her world. Lila stayed there for a long time, kneeling beside Eli, holding him, weeping. The rising sun painted the sky with hues of pink and gold, but Lila didn't notice. She was lost in her grief, in her despair, in the overwhelming sense of loss. She had lost everything. Her love, her brother, her future. She was alone, adrift in a world that had suddenly become cruel and unforgiving. As the sun climbed higher, Lila knew she couldn't stay there. She had to do something, to find a way to go on, to honor Eli's memory, to find some semblance of peace. She carefully laid Eli's body on the ground, covering him with his blanket. She kissed his forehead, a final goodbye, a promise to never forget him. She gathered her belongings, her heart heavy with sorrow. She saddled Wind, her trusty Appaloosa, her only remaining companion. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to leave this place of death and betrayal. She needed to find a new path, a new purpose, a new way to live. She rode away from the cabin, away from the scene of her heartbreak, away from the shattered remnants of her dreams. She rode towards the west, towards the setting sun, towards the unknown. As she rode, she thought of Eli, of his kindness, his strength, his love. She remembered the moments they had shared, the brief, intense connection that had blossomed between them. She remembered his smile, his touch, his voice. She also thought of Daniel, of his betrayal, of his cold-heartedness, of the brother she had lost forever. She felt a mixture of anger, grief, and pity. She pitied him for his blindness, for his hatred, for the emptiness that must consume him. She rode for days, stopping only to rest and water Wind. She avoided towns and settlements, keeping to the wilderness, seeking solace in the solitude of the vast, open landscape. She eventually found herself near a river, a wide, winding river that flowed through a valley, its waters reflecting the sky. She followed the river, letting it guide her, letting it lead her to wherever it may. She came to a place where the river bent, forming a small, secluded cove. It was a peaceful place, a place of beauty and tranquility, a place where she felt a sense of connection, a sense of belonging. She dismounted, unsaddling Wind, letting her graze on the lush grass that grew along the riverbank. She sat down on the riverbank, gazing at the flowing water, listening to its gentle murmur. She realized that this was where she needed to be. This was where she would start over, where she would rebuild her life, where she would honor Eli's memory. She would stay here, by the river, and find a way to heal, to find peace, to find a new purpose. She would weave new stories, stories of loss, of resilience, of hope. She would keep the spirit of her ancestors alive, and she would keep the memory of Eli alive in her heart. The river flowed on, carrying her sorrows, carrying her hopes, carrying her towards a new dawn. Where the river bent, Lila found not an end but a beginning. She had nothing but the vast, open world. But she was no longer lost. Not anymore. She knew which way to go. Forward. Chapter 17. The Serpent's Bargain. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Lila settled into her new life by the river, building a small, simple shelter, finding sustenance in the land, and slowly, painstakingly, beginning to heal. She spent her days weaving, her fingers working the familiar patterns, telling the stories of her people, of her loss, of her resilience. The river became her companion, its constant murmur a soothing balm to her wounded soul. She would sit by its banks for hours, gazing at the flowing water, finding solace in its rhythm, in its timelessness. She had buried Eli near the cabin in a simple grave marked by a pile of stones. She had visited the grave once before leaving, saying a final goodbye, promising to never forget him. She had left Daniel to his fate, to the consequences of his actions. She had not seen him since that horrific night, and she did not know if he was alive or dead. One day, as she was gathering berries near the riverbank, she heard a sound, a rustling in the bushes, a snapping of twigs. She froze, her heart pounding, her hand instinctively reaching for her knife. A figure emerged from the bushes, a man tall and gaunt, his face weathered and lined, his eyes dark and piercing. He wore the tattered remnants of a Confederate uniform, a faded gray coat, a battered hat. He carried a rifle, but he held it loosely, not in a threatening manner. Lila stood her ground, her knife held ready, her eyes wary. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice firm but cautious. The man stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing her. "The name's Caleb," he said, his voice raspy, his accent distinctly southern. "And you must be the Shoshone weaver." Lila's eyes widened in surprise. How do you know that?" she asked. Caleb smiled, a thin, humorless smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Word travels," he said. "Even in this wilderness, I've heard tales of a woman living alone by the river, a woman who weaves beautiful stories." He looked at her, his eyes intense. "I've also heard about your brother," he said, "about what he did." Lila felt a chill run down her spine. This man knew about Daniel, about Eli, about her past. He knew too much. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cold. Caleb shrugged. "I'm a businessman of sorts," he said. "I deal in information, and I believe you and I might be able to help each other." Lila's suspicion grew. This man was dangerous. She could sense it. He was like a serpent, coiled and ready to strike. "I don't need your help," she said, her voice firm. Caleb smiled again, that same thin, humorless smile. "Perhaps not," he said. "But I believe I have something you want." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. It was familiar, instantly recognizable. Lila gasped. That's Eli's father's journal," she said, her voice trembling. Caleb nodded. "Indeed it is," he said. "I acquired it from a certain associate of yours." Lila understood immediately. Daniel. He must have sold the journal to Caleb, probably for money, for supplies, for survival. "What do you want for it?" Lila asked, her voice barely a whisper. Caleb's eyes gleamed. "I want information," he said. "Information. About the Shoshone gold, about its location." Lila's heart sank. So that was it. He was after the gold, just like Blackwood. He was using the journal as bait, as a way to lure her into his trap. "I don't know anything about the gold," she lied, her voice steady. Caleb laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Don't play coy with me, woman," he said. "I know you do. Your brother told me everything." Lila felt a surge of anger, a burning rage at Daniel's betrayal, at his continued treachery. He had not only murdered Eli, but He had also betrayed his people, their heritage, their sacred secrets. "My brother is a liar," she said, her voice cold. "He doesn't know anything." Caleb's smile faded, his eyes hardening. "We'll see about that," he said. "I have ways of making people talk." He took a step closer, his hand moving towards the rifle. Lila tensed, ready to defend herself. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice firm. Caleb stopped, his eyes narrowing. He studied her for a moment, his gaze assessing her strength, her determination. He seemed to realize that he couldn't intimidate her, that he couldn't force her to cooperate. He changed his tactics, his voice softening, becoming almost persuasive. "Look," he said, "I'm not your enemy. I'm not like Blackwood. I'm not interested in violence. I'm just a businessman, looking for an opportunity." He held out the journal. "I'll give you this," he said. "In exchange for your help, we can work together, find the gold, share the profits." It was a serpent's bargain, a deal with the devil. Lila knew that she shouldn't trust him, that she should refuse his offer, that she should run away as fast as she could. But the journal, Eli's father's journal, it was a link to Eli, a connection to his past, a tangible reminder of the man she had loved. She hesitated, her mind torn. She wanted the journal, but she couldn't betray her people. She couldn't risk the gold falling into the wrong hands. I need time to think," she said, her voice hesitant. Caleb nodded, his eyes still gleaming. "I'll give you time," he said, "but not too much. I'll be back tomorrow, and I expect an answer." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the bushes, leaving Lila alone with her dilemma, with the serpent's bargain hanging heavy in the air. The river flowed on, oblivious to her turmoil, to the choice that could very well seal her fate or break her entirely. Chapter 18. A Gathering Storm. Lila spent the night wrestling with Caleb's offer, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. The journal. It was a tangible link to Eli, a piece of his past, something she desperately wanted to hold on to. But the price was too high. She couldn't betray her people. She couldn't risk the Shoshone gold falling into the hands of a man like Caleb. She paced by the riverbank, the moon casting long, distorted shadows, her mind racing, her heart torn. She thought of Eli, of his love for her, of his respect for her heritage. She knew what he would want her to do. He would want her to protect the gold, to honor her ancestors, to refuse Caleb's offer. But the temptation was strong. The journal. It held clues, memories, perhaps even a piece of Eli's soul. To have it in her hands, to read his father's words, to feel closer to him, it was almost unbearable to resist. As dawn approached, Lila finally made her decision. She would refuse Caleb's offer. She would protect the gold, no matter the cost. She would honor Eli's memory by staying true to her values, to her heritage. But she also knew that she couldn't simply refuse Caleb. He was dangerous, ruthless. He wouldn't take no for an answer. He would use force, violence, whatever it took to get what he wanted. She needed a plan, a way to outsmart him, to protect herself, to keep the gold safe. She spent the morning preparing, gathering supplies, sharpening her knife, thinking through every possible scenario. She decided to use the journal as bait, but not in the way Caleb expected. She would lead him on a false trail, a wild goose chase, away from the hidden valley, away from the real location of the gold. She carefully studied the journal, memorizing the passages that mentioned the gold, the cryptic clues that Eli's father had left behind. She then created a false map, a deliberately misleading document that would lead Caleb to a remote, desolate location, far from the actual hiding place. She practiced her story, rehearsing the lies she would tell Caleb, the false information she would feed him. She knew she had to be convincing. She had to play the part of a reluctant informant, someone who was being forced to cooperate against her will. As the sun reached its zenith, Lila saw him. Caleb was approaching, his figure silhouetted against the bright sky. He was walking slowly, confidently, his rifle held loosely in his hand. Lila took a deep breath, steeling herself. She had to be strong, she had to be brave, she had to be cunning. She had to outsmart the serpent. Caleb reached the riverbank, his eyes scanning Lila's face, searching for any sign of weakness, any hint of deception. "Have you made your decision?" he asked, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. Lila nodded, her gaze meeting his. "I have," she said, her voice trembling slightly but holding firm. I'll help you." Caleb smiled, that same thin, humorless smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I knew you'd see reason," he said. "You're a smart woman, Lila." But I need the journal first," Lila said, her voice hesitant. As a sign of good faith." Caleb hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. He studied her, trying to gauge her sincerity. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said, "but don't try anything foolish. I'm not a patient man." He handed her the journal. Lila took it, her fingers trembling as she touched the worn leather cover. She felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of grief, longing, and determination. "The gold. It's hidden. In the mountains," Lila said, her voice feigning reluctance. "Near Windrider's Peak." She pointed towards the distant mountains, her hand shaking slightly. Caleb's eyes followed her gesture, his gaze fixed on the towering peaks. "Where exactly?" he asked, his voice sharp. Lila pretended to consult the false map she had hidden in her clothing. There's a canyon," she said. "A hidden canyon called the Devil's Throat." It was a real place, Lila knew, a treacherous canyon known for its dangerous cliffs and unpredictable weather. It was a perfect place to lead Caleb, a place where he could easily get lost, injured, or even killed. Caleb studied the map, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He seemed to believe her, seemed to be falling for her deception. "Show me," he said, his voice commanding. "Lead the way." Lila nodded, her heart pounding. She had set the trap, and now she had to spring it. She had to lead Caleb into the Devil's Throat, and then she would figure out a way to escape, to leave him to his fate. She turned and walked towards the mountains, Caleb following close behind, his rifle held ready. A storm was gathering, both in the sky and in their hearts. The reckoning wind was blowing, and Lila knew that this journey would test her strength, her courage, her cunning, like never before. The game was on, and Lila aimed to win it. Chapter 19. Crossroads of Fate. The journey to the Devil's Throat was arduous, the terrain treacherous and unforgiving. Lila led Caleb through dense forests, across rocky slopes, and along narrow, winding trails. She maintained a steady pace, pretending to be driven by fear and reluctance, while secretly assessing the landscape, searching for an opportunity to escape. Caleb followed close behind, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, his rifle held ready. He was suspicious, wary, his trust in Lila paper-thin. He questioned her frequently, probing for inconsistencies, testing her resolve. Lila played her part convincingly, answering his questions with feigned hesitation, providing just enough information to keep him believing, but not enough to reveal the truth. She spoke of the curse of the gold, of the spirits that guarded it, of the dangers that awaited them in the canyon. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the weather began to change. Dark clouds gathered overhead. The wind picked up, and the air grew cold and damp. A storm was brewing, a reflection of the turmoil within Lila's heart, of the dangerous game she was playing. They reached the entrance to the Devil's Throat as the first raindrops began to fall. The canyon was a narrow, winding gorge, its walls steep and sheer, its floor strewn with rocks and boulders. The wind howled through the narrow passage, creating an eerie, unsettling sound. "This is it," Lila said, her voice barely a whisper above the wind. "The gold. It's hidden, somewhere inside." Caleb looked around, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Where?" he demanded. "Show me." Lila pointed towards a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, a barely visible opening hidden behind a large boulder. "There," she said. That's the entrance to the cave." It was a lie, of course. There was no cave, no gold, only a dead end, a trap. Caleb approached the crevice, his rifle held ready. He peered inside, his eyes searching the darkness. "I don't see anything," he said, his voice filled with frustration. "You have to go deeper," Lila said, her voice trembling. It's hidden, far inside." Caleb hesitated, his suspicion growing. He looked at Lila, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and something else. Doubt? Realization? "You're lying," he said, his voice low and menacing. "There's nothing here." Lila knew the game was up. He had seen through her deception. She had to act quickly before he could turn his anger on her. She turned and ran, scrambling over the rocks, heading deeper into the canyon. Caleb shouted after her, his voice filled with rage. He fired his rifle, the bullet whizzing past her head, embedding itself in the canyon wall. Lila didn't stop. She ran as fast as she could, her lungs burning, her heart pounding. She knew the canyon was a dead end, that there was no escape, but she had to try. She had to buy herself some time to find a way to fight back. She reached the end of the canyon, a sheer rock face that towered above her. There was nowhere to go. She was trapped. Caleb approached her slowly, his rifle aimed at her chest, his face contorted with fury. "You thought you could outsmart me?" he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You thought you could deceive me?" Lila stood her ground, her eyes meeting his. She was afraid, but she wouldn't show it. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "I did what I had to do," she said, her voice firm. "To protect my people, to honor Eli's memory." Caleb laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Eli," he said, "that weak, pathetic cowboy, he's dead. And you're going to join him." He raised his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. Lila closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. But the shot never came. Instead, a different sound echoed through the canyon. A familiar sound. The sound of a horse's hooves pounding on the rocky ground. Lila opened her eyes, her heart leaping with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Riding towards them, his figure silhouetted against the stormy sky, was Daniel. He was riding Wind, Lila's Appaloosa, his face a mask of determination, his rifle held ready. "Lila!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the canyon. "Get down!" Lila didn't hesitate. She dropped to the ground just as Daniel fired his rifle. The bullet struck Caleb in the shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped his rifle, clutching his wound, his eyes filled with pain and surprise. Daniel rode towards Caleb, his horse rearing, his hooves striking the ground with deadly force. He leaped from the horse, tackling Caleb to the ground. They wrestled on the rocky ground, grappling for control of Daniel's rifle. Caleb, despite his wound, was strong, desperate. He managed to overpower Daniel, pinning him to the ground, his hands reaching for his throat. Lila saw her chance. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing Caleb's discarded rifle. She aimed it at Caleb, her hands trembling, her heart pounding. "Let him go!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the canyon. Caleb looked up at her, his eyes filled with hatred. He tightened his grip on Daniel's throat, his face turning purple. Lila knew she had to shoot. She had to kill Caleb to save Daniel's life. But she hesitated. Could she do it? Could she take another life, even to save her brother? It felt like she stood at a crossroads, a choice, a fate. The storm raged around them, the wind howling, the rain lashing down. It was a moment of chaos, of violence, of life and death, a moment that would determine their future, their fate. A moment where Lila had to choose, once and for all, who she was and what she was willing to do. Chapter 20. The Final Thread. The wind screamed through the canyon, a wild, untamed force mirroring the turmoil within Lila's heart. Caleb's grip tightened on Daniel's throat, his face contorted with rage and desperation. Daniel struggled, his eyes bulging, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Lila stood frozen, the rifle heavy in her hands, her finger hovering over the trigger. Could she do it? Could she take a life, even to save her brother? The memory of Eli's lifeless body flashed before her eyes, the pain of his loss, a fresh, raw wound. She had sworn to honor his memory, but what did that mean? Did it mean avenging his death? Or did it mean choosing a different path, a path of peace, a path of forgiveness? The decision tore at her, a battle between her grief, her anger, and her deeply ingrained respect for life. She saw the hatred in Caleb's eyes, the violence that consumed him. She saw the desperation in Daniel's face, the plea for help. And then she saw something else, a flicker of regret, remorse in Daniel's eyes, a fleeting glimpse of the brother she had once known, the brother she had loved, before the darkness had consumed him. And that flicker, that tiny spark of humanity, was enough. It broke through the wall of anger and grief that had surrounded her heart. It reminded her of who she was, of what she believed in. She lowered the rifle, her finger releasing the trigger. She couldn't do it. She couldn't kill Caleb, not in cold blood. Not even to save Daniel. But she couldn't let Caleb kill Daniel either. She had to find another way. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. She stepped forward, her voice firm, her eyes locked on Caleb's. "Let him go, Caleb," she said, her voice echoing through the canyon. "It's over. You've lost." Caleb looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and contempt. You won't shoot?" he said, his voice hoarse. "You're weak, just like your cowboy." "I'm not weak," Lila said, her voice steady. "I'm choosing a different path, a path of peace, a path of forgiveness." She raised the rifle, not aiming at Caleb, but at the rock face above them. She fired. The bullets struck the rock, dislodging a shower of stones and debris. The sound echoed through the canyon, amplified by the narrow walls. Caleb flinched, startled by the sudden noise. He loosened his grip on Daniel's throat, his eyes darting towards the falling rocks. Daniel seized the opportunity. He pushed Caleb off him, scrambling to his feet. He grabbed his own rifle, which lay nearby. But he didn't aim it at Caleb. He stood beside Lila, his rifle lowered, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and gratitude. Caleb, seeing that he was outnumbered and outgunned, slowly rose to his feet. He looked at Lila, then at Daniel, his expression a mixture of anger and defeat. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I'll be back. Before he could finish his threat, a large rock, dislodged by Lila's shot, came crashing down from above. It struck Caleb on the head, knocking him to the ground. He lay there, still and silent, his body limp. Lila and Daniel stared at each other, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. The storm raged around them, the wind howling, the rain lashing down. But in that moment, amidst the chaos, a fragile peace had been forged. They checked on Caleb, confirming that he was dead. It was not the ending Lila had wanted. But it was an ending nonetheless. The threat was gone. The cycle of violence had been broken, not by more violence, but by a choice, a decision to choose a different path. They left Caleb's body in the canyon, a testament to the futility of hatred, of greed, of revenge. They gathered their horses, their belongings, and rode out of the Devil's Throat, leaving the storm behind them. As they rode, Daniel finally spoke, his voice filled with remorse. "I'm sorry, Lila," he said, "for everything. For Eli. For the gold. For all the pain I've caused you." Lila looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and forgiveness. "I know, Daniel," she said, "and I forgive you. Again." "I don't deserve it," Daniel said, his voice choked with emotion. "Maybe not," Lila said. "But we all deserve a second chance. We all deserve a chance to redeem ourselves." They rode in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic beat of their horses' hooves. "What will we do now?" Daniel asked, his voice hesitant. Lila thought for a moment. "We'll go back to the hidden valley," she said. "We'll return the gold to its rightful place. And then we'll start over. We'll build a new life, a life of peace, a life of purpose." Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. "Together?" he asked. Lila smiled, a genuine smile, a smile that reached her eyes. "Together," she said. They rode on towards the setting sun, towards a new beginning, towards a future where the threads of their lives, once broken, could be woven together again, stronger and more beautiful than before. The final thread had been woven, not in death, but in life, in forgiveness, in a shared commitment to a better future. They rode side by side. Lila had found her true north, and Daniel, finally, had found redemption. Epilogue. A new dawn. Years passed. The hidden valley, once a refuge from a world of violence and betrayal, blossomed into a place of healing and renewal. Lila and Daniel, bound by shared loss and a commitment to a better future, rebuilt their lives, their relationship stronger than ever before. They returned the Shoshone gold and artifacts to their sacred place, honoring their ancestors and safeguarding their heritage. They lived simply, respecting the land, finding solace in the rhythm of the seasons, in the quiet beauty of their surroundings. Lila continued to weave, her fingers creating intricate tapestries that told the stories of their past, their present, and their hopes for the future. Her art became renowned, sought after by traders and collectors, but she never sold the pieces that held the deepest meaning, the ones that wove the essence of her soul, of Eli's memory, of their shared journey. Daniel, shedding the darkness that had once consumed him, embraced his heritage with a newfound passion. He learned the old ways, the traditions of his people, becoming a skilled hunter, a respected leader, a protector of their sacred land. He carried the weight of his past mistakes, but he used that weight as a catalyst for growth, for redemption, for becoming the man Lila always knew he could be. They never forgot Eli. His memory lived on in Lila's heart, in her weavings, in the quiet moments, by the river where she would sit and remember his smile, his touch, his unwavering spirit. She built a small memorial for him in the hidden valley, a circle of stone surrounding a single, sturdy pine tree, a place where she could go to feel close to him, to honor his sacrifice, to whisper her love into the wind. One crisp autumn day, as Lila sat by the river weaving a new tapestry, she saw a figure approaching on horseback. A familiar figure, tall and lean, silhouetted against the setting sun. Her heart leaped, a mixture of hope and disbelief flooding through her. Could it be? Could it possibly be? The rider drew closer, and Lila's breath caught in her throat. It was him. But it wasn't Eli. It couldn't be. The rider dismounted, his movements graceful and familiar. He was younger than Eli, but he carried himself with the same quiet strength, the same gentle nature. He had Eli's blue eyes, the same shape of his jaw, the same hint of a smile playing on his lips. He approached Lila, his gaze searching hers, his expression a mixture of curiosity and something else. Recognition? Kinship? "My name is Samuel," he said, his voice low and resonant, like the echo of a distant memory. "Samuel Tanner. I believe my father knew you." Lila stared at him, her eyes wide with wonder. Eli's son. A son he had never known, a legacy he had left behind. A living embodiment of the man she had loved, of the future they had never shared. Tears welled up in her eyes, tears of grief, of joy, of a bittersweet reunion that transcended time and space. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, he did. He knew me very well." She invited Samuel into the valley, sharing stories of his father, of their brief, intense time together, of the love that had blossomed between them, of the sacrifice he had made. She showed him Eli's memorial, the circle of stones, the single pine tree, a testament to a life lived with courage, with compassion, with unwavering spirit. Samuel stayed for many days, listening to Lila's stories, learning about his father, connecting with a past he had never known. He saw the beauty of the hidden valley, the strength of Lila and Daniel's bond, the resilience of the human spirit. He saw the tapestry Lila was weaving, a vibrant, intricate design that depicted a cowboy riding towards a setting sun, a Shoshone woman waiting by a river, a single thread of gold connecting their two worlds. He understood, without needing to be told, the depth of the love, the pain of the loss, the enduring power of hope. As Samuel prepared to leave, he turned to Lila, his blue eyes filled with gratitude and something more. A promise. "I'll come back," he said, his voice firm. "I'll visit again." Lila smiled, a genuine smile, a smile that reached her eyes and illuminated her soul. "I know you will," she said. He mounted his horse and rode away, disappearing to the vast expanse of the prairie. Lila watched him go, her heart filled with a sense of peace, of completion, of a circle finally closed. The new dawn had arrived. The past was not forgotten, but it no longer held her captive. The future was uncertain, but it was filled with hope, with the possibility, with the promise of new connections, new beginnings. The river flowed on, carrying her towards a destiny she could not yet fully grasp, but one she embraced with an open heart, a resilient spirit, and the enduring legacy of a love that had transcended time, distance, and even death. The threads of the past, present, and future were interwoven, creating a tapestry of life, rich with beauty, sorrow, and the enduring power of the human spirit. The end.